Hello everyone! Today I'd like to unpack how Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë, one of the most beloved novels in English literature and a classic that's read in schools everywhere, managed to make me question whether or not endurance is really a virtue. So personally, I first picked up Jane Eyre my freshman year of college as an assigned book for literature class. I'm an English major, so I read just about everything from historical fiction to fantasy, essays, even the occasional bad thriller. And at first, I didn't expect to have strong feelings about Jane Eyre, to be honest. It was homework and not exactly a passion project. But then something shifted. Everyone in my literature class was excited to read it again, and most of them had already read it at least once before, sometimes even twice before. And they talked about it like it was a rite of passage, one of those books that changes you. So, somewhere between their enthusiasm and my own curiosity, I started to hope it would move me too. I wanted to understand what they saw in it and to feel that same rush people talked about when they say a book stays with them forever and mean it. Now, looking back, I can safely say that thought was too optimistic. By the time I turned the final page, I wasn't inspired so much as I was relieved. I finished it late one evening in my dorm room, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead with a constant hum, and just sat there staring at the last line thinking, that's it? I was disappointed, sure, but also strangely tired because the book had asked for more emotional energy than I was capable of giving. And maybe that's fitting because Jane Eyre itself feels like a story about giving and giving and giving until there's nothing left to give. It promises fire and instead delivers something lukewarm. And honestly, that may be the best way to describe Jane Eyre, lukewarm till the end. Though even that might be too generous. Now, people say disappointment teaches you something, that even bad experiences have meaning, and maybe that's true. Maybe Jane Eyre serves a purpose, if only to show how fiercely people will defend a book that feels so utterly lifeless in all the wrong ways. Take my aunt, for instance. She adores this novel. Absolutely adores it. She rereads it every year and treats it like scripture. So when she found out I recently finished it, she invited me over and told me she wanted to hear my thoughts. We sat at her dining table, the book right there between us, her dog asleep at my feet, steam drifting lazily from her mug when she asked, "Well, did you love it?" And I told her the truth. I probably said something like, it's dry, anticlimactic, and felt like the literary equivalent of watching paint dry. The look on her face was unforgettable, to say the least. And look, I get it. People love this book, but that doesn't make it flawless. Now, for anyone who hasn't read it, Jane Eyre is set in 19th century England, which was a deeply class-bound and patriarchal world. Jane, our orphan protagonist, starts life unwanted and is described as poor, plain, and invisible. She grows up at her cruel aunt's estate, then at a harsh boarding school, and eventually becomes a governess at Thornfield Hall, where she meets her employer, Edward Rochester. That's the basic setup. And for a while, the story almost works. The beginning has this spark to it that makes Jane's earlier chapters feel alive. She's mistreated, yes, but she knows she deserves better and actually acknowledges it as a fact. You can feel her raw determination leaping off the pages, and briefly, for a moment, you believe she's going to rise above everything that's held her back. That this young, defiant English girl is going to throw away the class burdens weighing her down and set a new precedent. And then Rochester shows up. He's supposed to be this dark, mysterious, Byronic hero type, and in a sense he is, but beneath that, he's just exhausting. He's a deeply manipulative man who mocks Jane endlessly, plays games with her loyalty, hides a literal wife in the attic, and we as readers are supposed to find him, desirable? The book insists that this is passion, that love can excuse cruelty as long as it's deep enough, but it's not passion, it's elaborate Victorian gaslighting. And the worst part is that Jane falls for it, over and over again. The woman who once stood up to every figure of authority in her life suddenly bends to Rochester's moods like he's gravity. Every ounce of independence built in the first chapters just dissolves the moment he appears. Then there's this cross-dressing scene in which Rochester pretends to be a fortune teller in order to get Jane to admit her feelings. I had to read it twice because I honestly thought I misremembered that particular scene. The novel treats it like it's this genius idea. I found it bizarre and almost disturbing in a way because it's communicating the idea that the only manner in which Rochester can approach Jane is by pretending to be a woman. I couldn't help but wonder if that was supposed to add to the romance. The fact that he can't acknowledge Jane's emotions unless he's wearing a dress, that's not clever. It's awkward and unnecessary. Next, we get to Bertha Mason, the mad woman in the attic. This was a moment where the book had an opportunity to say something profound about repression and gender, an opportunity that Brontë bypasses and instead uses to turn a woman into a metaphor. Bertha is everything Jane is not allowed to be. Emotional, passionate, and unpredictable. She basically represents everything that Victorian society, and by extension the novel, fears in women. But Brontë doesn't explore her as a person. She's just an obstacle whose destruction is treated like catharsis. When Bertha burns Thornfield to the ground, it's not a moment of liberation. Bertha dies, and suddenly the story is free to give Jane the happy ending built on another woman's ashes. That's not a feminist victory, that's moral convenience. And from that point on, the writing itself starts to unravel. The first half has tension, where every decision matters and has consequences, whereas the second half just floats along on coincidence. Jane nearly dies on the moors, only to stumble into long-lost relatives. She inherits a fortune because she needs to be on equal footing with Rochester, and she meets St. John Rivers, whose proposal is really just another test of endurance disguised as romance. And then comes the infamous telepathic moment. Jane hears Rochester's voice calling to her from miles away, literally hears it across the moors, and hundreds of pages of moral restraint later, we're suddenly in Gothic mind meld territory? I remember looking up from the book and thinking, sure, Brontë, why not? By the time Jane makes it back to Thornfield, the mansion's gone. Rochester's blind and maimed thanks to Bertha's stint with arson, and that's what ultimately makes them equals. Rochester has to be physically broken down, and Jane has to be rich for them to be on equal footing and able to love each other. It's poetic in theory, but mostly just depressing. And that's where Jane Eyre's supposed feminism starts to crack. On paper, Jane looks independent. She refuses St. John's cold proposal, she leaves Rochester when he betrays her, she insists on moral agency at every turn, but all of her choices exist inside a box the story builds for her. She's rewarded for restraint rather than rebellion, for patience, not power. The novel pretends to celebrate strength, but what it really does is glorify endurance. And notice that her freedom comes only after everyone else falls apart, but not as something she wins. She survives just long enough to be handed it. Her freedom is only acceptable when it looks like quiet submission. In Rochester, let's be honest, isn't some tragic romantic hero. He's a man who lies, manipulates, and hides his wife, and yet we're told to read his suffering as redemption. He doesn't change, he just loses enough that the story decides he's humbled. And as I've said, the idea that Jane needs to forgive him to complete her arc isn't empowering so much as it is exhausting. This is also what makes the ending itself so hollow. Jane begins with fire and ends with endurance. She spends an entire novel learning to contain herself, and the story calls that a victory. When I finally closed the book that night in my dorm, there was relief, but also this dull ache. Like I'd spent all that time waiting for Jane to be free, only to watch her settle into a softer kind of cage. And a few weeks later, sitting at that same table with my aunt, watching her dog shift in his sleep as she sipped her tea, she told me I was missing the entire point. And maybe she's right. Maybe Jane Eyre isn't meant to be loved. Maybe it's meant to frustrate, to show how little freedom women were allowed, and how even fiction couldn't imagine more. And maybe that's the real endurance, not Jane's, but our own, in reading it. But those were my thoughts on Jane Eyre, and that's all I have for today. Thanks so much for listening.